are live. I hope that we have members of the Oslo Freedom Forum community with us. It's a pleasure to again be with OFF, even virtually, and hosting a discussion on one of the most important themes of our time, on what is happening behind the scenes, what is changing history now, what certain states in particular are doing in terms of sponsoring the hacking, the wholesale hacking of dissidents, networks, civilians, something that affects us all potentially. Those of you on screen will be familiar to many of those who follow these themes and who are part of the OFF community. I'm going to introduce them in a moment. Just to say, I'm Philippa Thomas. I've been presenting and moderating for the Oslo Freedom Forum since 2011. Very proud to be a part of this community. I'm also going to say, for those of you who are with us, do feel free to put observations and questions into the chat, and I will try to bring in the themes that you're interested in and the remarks you want to make as well. So even though we are virtual, we are in this together. We are going to hear conversations with 3 different thinkers, and then the conversations between them and with you, I hope. So with me, Iyad al-Baghdadi will be talking primarily about the Saudis, but we will also reflect more widely on what he has witnessed. I'll introduce him to you further in a moment. Jae-Yeon Bak is going to talk about North Korea primarily. She is founder and co-director of Lumen and has just left us video-wise, but I think is still with us. So we will we'll go back. And Andy Greenberg, a senior writer for Wired. And Andy is also going to be able to tell us something about his most recent book, Sandworm, A New Era of Cyber War and the Hunt for the Kremlin's Most Dangerous Hackers. He will primarily be talking about Russia. But as you can tell, there are a lot of themes and a lot of connections that we are going to try to bring together. Now, Jian, I think, is possibly dropped off because this is the nature of these things. But I'm going to assume she's coming back. There she is. Lovely. We will, I'm sure this will happen to all of us, including me. So any of us could pick up and host at any time. But let's start with Iyad al-Baghdadi, who describes himself as an Islamic libertarian. That's what it says on your Twitter feed. I hope you're still... a Palestinian writer who came to the world's attention and the attention of the Oslo Freedom Forum as you commented, as you witnessed the Arab Spring uprisings, and you continue to throw light on dark places in what you do. You are a long-time networker with the Oslo Freedom Forum. We are talking today about how Saudi Arabia, Russia, North Korea are using their influence and their resources to hack not just their own civilians, but globally. And Iyad, we want to talk in particular about the Saudis. What would you say first about what's distinctive about the way they operate in terms of state-sponsored hacking?
What's unique, I mean, what's different from other contexts, I guess, is the fact, I mean, if that is the question, it would be that they're not disciplined. In other words, they're kind of in your face about what they're doing in a way that has not served them very well. But, you know, if I want to zoom out, their hacking activity is only part of a network. It's part of a bigger mechanism. So in order for you to be able to completely dominate an otherwise dynamic public sphere, such as the Saudi public sphere was circa 2014, even before, starting with the Arab Spring, really, you need not only to take down the influencers and control the conversation, but you need to also plug it into a disinformation network. So we see a lot of intersection between their disinformation network and their hacking technology. These things kind of work in tandem. At the same time, you have the state itself, represented, of course, by the leadership and by the foreign ministry, giving not just resources but also political capital to a lot of these narratives. In many cases, this is something that was kind of surprising to us, but we've seen it several times. What we see stolen using hacked data ends up on the disinformation network, and then what happens on the disinformation network is later reflected in state narratives, basically the foreign ministry, the state secretary for foreign affairs. So it's an integrated system there that shows that this is not just, it's not just a tool, in other words, this is a system.
So what kind of information is stolen and what kind of thefts are most damaging?
So it depends who they're targeting, to be honest. So in the context of 2014, 2015, so this is when they actually started this effort. And to be completely clear, the effort does not originate only in Saudi Arabia. In 2011, when we had the Oslo Freedom Forum in 2011, and of course 2011 was a very, very special year for the Arab world because the Arab Spring was going on. One of the most important speakers was Bahraini activist Mariam Al-Khawaja. And if people in the community remember, there was an incident where one of the hashtags was taken over by the Bahraini internet, kind of troll farm. The Oslo Freedom Forum, they kind of tried to outmaneuver the Oslo Freedom Forum's own hashtag because they didn't want people to be speaking about Bahrain. This is of course, in the middle of the uprising, or shortly after the Bahraini uprising. So that's when we see the genesis of those kind of dictatorships realizing that there is actually power to social media, and a lot of your personal information and your Twitter app reside on the same phone. So it makes sense for them to actually target both at the same time in that information space, right? However, in 2012 was the big year because 2012 is when, we say that the Arab Spring was like a social media uprising and stuff, but actually the greatest rise in the audiences and the usage of social media in the Arab region came after 2011, especially in 2012 to 2014. And in 2012, I think it was the summer, around July of 2012, Twitter actually put out a press release saying that there's been an increase, I think a 3,000% increase or something like that in Twitter usage from Saudi Arabia.
Much of which is very young.
Much exactly. But again, the thing is, when you see a 3,000% increase in a short period of time, you know that a lot of it is bots. It's not all organic. That kind of increases don't kind of happen overnight, right? So whenever you see such a big increase, you know that actually the government is also involved. 2014 is when the Saudis attempted. So 2013 was really significant because that's when we see a lot of social media activity manipulated, but also taking down certain influencers. So like they want to create the impression that certain things are popular when they're not, for example, right? So one thing they do is that they have to create fake identities, but also one other thing they need to do is take down actual influencers, human beings, right? And one of the ways to do that is to track them, hack their phones, figure out what they care about, figure out what their weaknesses are, and they basically target them. In 2014, I was arrested in the United Arab Emirates and expelled from the country because of this activity. I had an active Twitter account. Late 2014 was also when the Saudis implanted a spy inside Twitter, inside the company. That spy, of course, was later found out by the FBI. And the Saudi embassy in the United States facilitated the escape of a couple people back to Saudi Arabia. So, and also 2013, 2014 is when we know they actually started caring. They started building the capacity, the hacking capacity in Saudi Arabia. But really, it wasn't really until 2016, 2017 when we've seen it really crank up to the point of becoming something that is dangerous, not just for dissidents like myself, but to the world at large. July 2016, I think April 2016 is when Mohammed bin Salman declared the Vision 2030. And that was kind of a harbinger for their direct control of the public sphere. Keep in mind, the Saudi public sphere was very, very active at the time. It was a beautiful public sphere. And they knew that they had to destroy it because when people express themselves freely, they kind of liberate themselves from imposed narratives, the narratives imposed upon them by the governments. So the hacking activity, a lot of that happened between 2014 and 2016. 2016, a friend, Ahmed Mansour, who's from the United Arab Emirates, he's a human rights defender who's currently serving a term in prison in the United Arab Emirates. He was hacked by software that the UAE purchased from an Israeli company. And this is, by the way, a repeated theme. You'll see a repeated theme that a lot of these dictators buy it. They don't develop the software themselves. They buy it mostly from Israel, which is, of course, raises an interesting political question, of course, with all the normalization deals happening right now.
Yes,
yeah, because all of these, I mean, whether it's Bahrain or the United Arab Emirates or Saudi Arabia, these are countries that have been using Israeli hacking and disinformation technology for many years.
I want to pick up on that in a moment about where the tech comes from and kind of common sources here. I want to go back on something you said about it was a beautiful public sphere that is being targeted, that is being destroyed. Because one of the things that hacking does is it not only targets and maybe seeks to destroy individuals who are out there, dissidents who are known like yourself. It not only represses, but it suppresses networks and people that are emerging. So if it's not safe to go into what was a beautiful space, what does a nascent activist in the Saudi sphere do now that you can talk about?
Now it's a completely different world right now. So to take you back to the point about beautiful public sphere and how that intersects with hacking, one of the most important things they would want if they hack my account, for example, is that they want to go into my Twitter DMs to the direct messages, and they want to know who I'm exchanging messages with. Sure. Because they're very concerned. Like, one of the reasons why they want to hack me is my public announcements, my public activity on Twitter, on social media. And they want to drive the narrative. They want complete control of the narrative on social media. So it's like the disinformation aspect and the hacking aspect is kind of tied together. This was the case with Jamal Khashoggi. It was the case with Omar Abdulaziz. It was the case with even Ben Hubbard, for example, was writing a book in the summer of 2018. He was targeted in the summer of 2018, I believe, or maybe I can't remember the date, either 2018 or 2019. So returning to your initial question, like what is unique about the Saudis, I think it's the systemic element, but also the fact that they're not disciplined, in a sense that by looking at the public part, what they're doing with the disinformation stuff, they kind of tell you who they're targeting. And if we know who they're targeting, we kind of find out what their plan is. And this is something that we can come back to, because that's how we uncovered their plan, their hack of Jeff Bezos's phone.
Let's go back to where you had reached, which was the provision of hacking technology by the Israelis. And I want to ask you now about the evidence that lies behind that, because I think you're saying not just to the Saudis, but the provisions that are being made to other states like Belarus, for example. But I think, and I know from previous conversations, you've referenced that there's evidence, and that there's extensive evidence here.
Yeah, and thankfully, Israeli journalists have been doing their job. And so a lot of this, a lot of what I've mentioned is really in the public sphere. And it was Israeli journalists who uncovered that. So they uncovered that not only have they pushed a part of, if we're talking about the Middle East, we know that they have pushed this technology. They have, provided this technology to Bahrain, to the United Arab Emirates, to Oman, to the Saudis. We also know that they have had activities in Belarus and in Venezuela. This is all stuff that's been uncovered by, as I said, by Israeli newspapers. It's basically out. It's public record. What's interesting recently is that, like when they hack your phone, they're going to get a lot of data, and they have like the software is called Pegasus. It's made by a company called NSO. NSO is a professional company, and the software itself is military grade, which means that it has very advanced methods of avoiding detection. One of its main jobs is to avoid detection. What's interesting about the recent revelations about the software is it self-destructs if you cross into certain countries. So like, it's very aware that this is a very advanced piece of software, and they don't want it to be captured. They don't want it to be captured by the Iranians or the Russians, for example. And they don't want it to cause a diplomatic incident in the United States, for example. So if you cross the border with an infected device and you go to certain countries, the software self-destructs. The software is also very good at hiding itself. And what's interesting is that they don't need a lot from you as a user to actually get into your phone. So they can actually get into your phone even if you don't click on anything. All they need to know is what your phone number is. So as I said, very advanced software. What was recently very concerning to us is that, they can steal a lot of data, but they don't know what it means. I mean, this has been a problem really especially with the Saudis. They don't have enough analysts, and they don't have skilled analysts. So they can steal the information from you, like it's gigabytes of information. Like, who's going to analyze it? It's a lot of data, right? And they don't know what it means, and they don't know how to action it. Well, recently, Israeli military analysts have been actually providing that service as well. And this is, again, on the record in Israeli press. So not only are the Saudis getting the software, getting the hacking tool, they also don't need to analyze it themselves because the Israelis are doing that for them.
I think I can see connections that we can make, which is about, it often comes down to this, doesn't it? Resourcing. It's where you get the basic, the software, the hacking capacity, but it's also about the shared resourcing of intelligence analysis. And I think Ayad will come back, but I also want to pick up with our other panelists now. Gian, I see, I don't know whether we see you now, which is great. And I think I'll assume that if your video disappears, that you're still with us. And I'm going to invite you at this point to just open by telling us a little bit about Lumen and about what you're doing to reveal the extent of North Korean state hacking.
Sure. So I'm just reflecting on some of the things that Ayad had said, and there's some similarities between Saudi's capabilities and discipline, or lack thereof, in North Korea. So I'll pick up on those parallels in a little bit. But with Lumen, we are a US-based organization, and we work to distribute information into North Korea. So it's sort of in the it's in the general sphere of information and technology. It does not have to do with North Korea's hacking capabilities or cyber warfare capabilities, which I will talk about in a second. But it's very much aligned with trying to bring access to information to North Korean people, to those who choose to consume it. So that's what we are focused on. And so I'll briefly talk about, I want to share a bit about North Korea's growing cyber capabilities. And I'll open with a quote from Kim Jong-un from 2013. And he said, this is a quote of his, this is the North Korean dictator: "The cyber warfare, along with nuclear weapons and missiles, is an all-purpose sword that guarantees military's capability to strike relentlessly." End quote. And unlike what Iyad said about Saudi's capabilities, North Korea has been very disciplined in growing their cyber capabilities. And they've been investing in their cyber capabilities since the 1970s. And this is in part because cyber strategy, it stems from their larger military asymmetric strategy. I won't get too much into the inter-Korean history right now, unless it comes up in Q&A. But ever since that South Korea started to outpace the North economically since the 1970s, we saw in parallel the North investing in their asymmetric military capabilities, mainly in nuclear and in cyber. And it makes sense because it's a very attractive method for North Korea, because as long as the status quo remains as it is, which is that as long as the South Korean peninsula remains in a stalemate, because technically the Koreas are still at war with each other, and as long as there's a strong military alliance with the South Koreans and the US, and as long as the US, which is North Korea's existential enemy, or sworn enemy, as long as the US maintains conventional military superiority, and as long as North Korea aims to undermine the South Korean state, the North Koreans will be motivated to continuously diversify its arsenal of asymmetric and unconventional methods. They know they don't have a fighting chance, as Victor Cha said, sword to sword, soldier to soldier. And so fighting their enemies, whether it's governments or companies that are housed in their enemy states, through conventional warfare is not going to happen. And so doing so in this unlawful war zone, if you will, called cyberspace, by an actor that's just known to not follow the rules in general, this being North Korea, they can create chaos, steal information, sealed dollars with relatively few resources and relatively few, if any, consequences. And just a fun fact, if you will, according to a UN report that came out a little over a year ago, the North Korean regime has accumulated approximately $2 billion through stealing from banks and cryptocurrency exchanges over the years to dedicate towards their weapons of mass destruction programs, $2 billion. And so their capabilities with regards to cyber warfare, their personnel is growing, and it continues to grow. And so they are certainly not an equal to the United States or some of the other or the other great powers, but they are not to be underestimated. We can get into the details of some of the known attacks that they have conducted over the years against state and non-state actors, but I'll kind of leave it from here. In terms of, I just want to draw that discipline point between Saudi and the North Koreans. They are very disciplined. Some of the cyber warrior, there's different terms for them in the media, in the media, cyber warrior, cyber warfare soldiers, whatever else. But essentially, the personnel who the state pinpoints to then train to become part of this, their cyber warfare team, they are highly skilled. They're skilled from a young age. They are skilled in the country and the language and the culture that they are assigned to, the country or the region that they're assigned to. And they dedicate essentially their every waking moment to pursue the tasks that they are assigned to. And so I was reading a report recently that came out from McAfee, and there were some of the senior chief engineers were talking about just some of the trends that they saw of North Korea's hacking capabilities. And I just remember a line from that report saying that the North Koreans are very, very, very dedicated in their pursuits. And so they're certainly not to be underestimated, which makes them very dangerous in terms of what they are capable and will continue to be capable of doing. It's a pretty grim note to end my remarks, but I'm happy to open it up.
It is, and I do want to hear the others' reactions actually to what's happening here. The question I want to get in at this point is really, they're extremely disciplined. They're very well resourced in terms of cyber warfare. And so when you think in terms of defensive strategies or sanctioning, they don't care. The world knowing how brilliant they have become at cyber warfare actually is an asset to them too. So what works, or what could work, or does nothing work in terms of stemming this growing cyber warfare empire masterminded from Pyongyang?
I think it's hard to, just because we don't know what their next attack surface is going to be. It could be an individual, it could be a government state website, or a bank, or another non-state actor. I think just in general, beefing up cybersecurity measures from these entities and all of the kind of known protective measures and defensive mechanisms, great. There's been a lot of sanctions, and I think recently the U.S. government has seized, I think, 280 cryptocurrency accounts that have been known to basically work on behalf of the North Korean regime on Chinese cryptocurrency exchanges. And so there's been some, slap on the wrists for actors in this space, but nowhere does it's nowhere near a point where it's going to sufficiently deter the North from what they want to do. I think that ultimately, this is kind of where I'm quite biased, and what I work on often is hit them where it hurts asymmetrically, which is to hit at the regime's Achilles heel, where they're asymmetrically vulnerable, which is just making information available into North Korea. It's not an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth kind of situation here, but ultimately the eroding the internal legitimacy of the system and hitting them where it hurts, which is providing unfettered information to their citizens, is, I think, the most powerful tool that citizens and governments alike can do to respond back to North Korea, not only because of their cyber strategies, but also because it's just the right thing to do.
Jian, thank you. I am going to come on to Russia and to Andy in just a moment. I just wanted to invite from either of you, Iyad or Andy, any thoughts on what we've just heard, perhaps particularly the idea of the way to hit back when you have a very well-funded, very determined strategy.
Yeah, I was really interested in the point that Jian made about the discipline. By the way, the fact that the North Koreans are disciplined, discipline denotes predictability. In other words, you know what they will and they won't do because you know what their target is, you know their MO. One of the main problems we had with the Saudis is the fact that they're undisciplined. And because they're undisciplined, there's nothing that you can say, hey, that's too crazy for them to do. It doesn't make sense for them to do it. If they can do it, they might do it. In other words, instead of me as watching my adversary and thinking what is rational for my adversary to do in this position, I have to think in terms of their capability, which is much wider than I can't think what would they do, but what can they do, and that makes it more difficult to defend. But point taken, of course. If you want to, if you have a cyber army, ideally, you don't want anyone to even know that you're doing anything. You want it to be completely, you want to go in, steal information, challenge narratives, etc., and leave. And you don't want anyone to know that you even that you even was in their phone in the first place, or that. If you have this information output, you don't want people to even know that this is inauthentic behavior. You want people to actually think that this is authentic. So this is the point. I mean, this is the point that kind of rung in my head. But then there's the point also about the reason why they're doing this. For the Saudis, so for North Koreans, and I think maybe you can comment on that as well. It seems to me that for the North Koreans, what they're really looking after is attack their enemies, disrupt their enemies, and also steal, like get a lot, like you said, $2 billion is a lot of money. For the Saudis are not really short on cash. Even though they should be worried because they are running out of cash reserves, so that they absolutely do have a problem with long term. I mean, at least in the short term, they don't. But for the Saudis, it's really all about legitimacy. It's all about legitimacy narratives, because all they want is, it's all about free speech in the public sphere, because they want to sell a narrative about the state, about Mohammed bin Salman, about what's happening in the world, kind of selling a story, saying that this is what the government wants, and trying to create public opinion, of course, fake public opinion, to say that this is actually popular. So it's all about attacking dissidents. It's about the public sphere. It's about free speech. And again, it's in the end, it's about a battle for legitimacy, because this is, since 2011, since the Arab Spring uprisings, the entire regional order has had a really severe legitimacy deficit, and it's really, legitimacy is the name of the game.
Yeah, and there's a lot of legitimacy narratives that North Korea is pursuing, both internally and externally, and I can talk more about that. I'd love to hear Andy's thoughts as well. I feel like I've been talking a little bit too much.
This is such a fascinating panel. I'm learning a lot from both of you guys, and I think what I'm like, it's very interesting to hear these ideas about discipline, because to me, there are several different ways to define discipline for a cyber power. There's the sense of like, to what degree are they willing to be caught? And it seems to me that actually all three of these powers are somewhat willing to, they're sloppy, they're not disciplined in the sense of trying to prevent attribution, which is this kind of age-old problem in cybersecurity. Can you trace the source of a state-sponsored, of a sophisticated hack? For Russia, North Korea, and Saudi, it seems like they're willing to allow attribution, to leave their fingerprints on an attack if it allows them to achieve their goals. So I think that in that sense, all three of these countries are not disciplined in that way. But I think also what they have in common, maybe in a different definition of discipline, is that rogue cyber powers, in a sense, like each Saudi, in its willingness to attack human rights defenders and use these unprecedented zero-day exploits, unpatched vulnerabilities in software. North Korea, in its state-sponsored cybercrime, is totally unique. I mean, there's no other country in the world that I know of that is stealing money, using hacking on this scale. But for Russia, Russia is a rogue cyber power in the sense that they are carrying out the kind of cyber war that I've been covering cybersecurity for like more than a dozen years. We've always dreaded the day when state-sponsored hackers would turn out the lights in an adversary country, would shut down medical record systems in hospitals, or paralyze hospital systems, or destroy all of the data in an enemy's government agencies. And now all of those things have actually come to life. They've all happened just in the last several years, and all actually at the hands of one hacker group, one group of Russian hackers known as Sandworm. And I have been following this one group because they are just so much at the vanguard of this one kind of very norm-breaking rogue form of hacking, which is pure cyber war, the actual disruption and destruction of an enemy's critical infrastructure, and often an enemy's civilian critical infrastructure. Sandworm came onto my radar in 2015. I didn't know who they were at the time, but I think as everyone in the cybersecurity world became aware that a group of Russian hackers had actually caused a blackout in Ukraine. Now, of course, like Russia had invaded Ukraine in 2014, but what became clear as I looked deeper into this cyber attack on a group of Ukrainian electric utilities that turned out the lights to 250,000 Ukrainians was that this Russian invasion of Ukraine that kind of set off a civil war in the east of the country. I mean, if you can call it that, it's truly a Russian invasion, and seized the Crimean Peninsula. That this physical invasion was accompanied by an actual cyber war that had performed targeted attacks against all these Ukrainian targets, from the media to government agencies, destroying terabytes of data inside of these institutions and really trying to cripple them, and culminating in that first blackout. Then a year later, in December of 2016, they caused a second blackout, this time in the capital of Kyiv. And at this point, I could see that there was a kind of escalating true cyber war happening. And that second attack, these Sandworm hackers had actually used a kind of custom-coded piece of malware designed to automate the process of causing a blackout, which is a very scary prospect because it means they can repeat it. They can repeat this. They can swap out parts of the code and do this in Western Europe or in the United States. So I went to Ukraine and at that point really delved into this Ukrainian cyber war and put together a piece for Wired magazine, where I work, about this notion that Ukraine was a kind of canary in the coal mine. If you looked at Ukraine, you could see the future of cyber war because Russia was carrying it out in Ukraine. They were experimenting, innovating, and showing their capabilities. And just as I published this story, which was a big magazine piece for Wired, Sandworm, the same group of hackers, released in Ukraine a piece of malware, malicious software called NotPetya. NotPetya was a self-propagating, automated spreading worm, and it quickly proved to be the most destructive cyber attack in history. It took out, it would spread using a combination of a stolen NSA hacking technique and some other open source tools, and hijacking the software updates of this Ukrainian accounting software, all kind of combined in a very clever way. This worm spread across Ukraine instantaneously, took down 300 companies in Ukraine by some estimates, many hospitals across the country, 22 banks, every government agency, but then spread, of course, worms, cyber attacks do not respect national borders, especially when they're self-propagating in this way. So it spread to the entire world from Ukraine, and immediately took down Maersk, the world's largest shipping firm, Merck, the US pharmaceutical company, FedEx, causing each of these companies, essentially destroying their entire networks, causing them hundreds of millions of dollars in damage each. So when you add up the effects of NotPetya, ultimately the estimates would put the damages from NotPetya at $10 billion, by far the biggest. I mean, nothing we have seen before or since has even come close. Although I'm sure June would point out that WannaCry, this North Korean cyber attack, did cause like $4 billion. But this was $10 billion, and it also took out medical record systems across the United States. This very underreported phenomenon, and I think endangered people's lives. So I don't mean I don't want to downplay what Iyad and Jiyun are talking about, which is, I think, often more surveillance focused, information warfare, cybercrime, and in North Korea's case, sometimes cyber warfare too. But what I've been focused on is this kind of actual use of cyber attacks as a direct weapon against an adversary, and it can have terribly destructive effects. And I think that what I've tried to call attention to is the fact that Russia now has this capability. They're willing to use it, and it will be a factor in every kind of question of how do we counter Russia's influence in the world. They have this weapon now available to them, and they're willing to use it.
You just froze at the most intriguing point, and you're back. And I think I want to get the reaction of both of our other panelists to what you're saying, Andy. But first, I have to say to you, election 2020. We're what, 5 weeks away?
Right. And we have already seen signs that, so to spoil the ending of my book, where I kind of like try to figure out who Sandworm is.
Yeah.
They are a unit of Russia's military intelligence agency known as the GRU. The GRU, of course, was also involved. Sandworm was involved, but also another group within GRU called Fancy Bear, or APT-28, were the ones who were responsible for the hacking and leaking operations in the 2016 election cycle. Fancy Bear was the one who broke into the Democratic National Committee, Congressional Campaign Committee, and the Clinton campaign, stole a bunch of emails and leaked them out in this very, chaos-inducing way that was, of course, designed to help elect Donald Trump. And I think succeeded, contributed to his success. Now we're seeing signs that Fancy Bear has returned, that they are probing. I think, according to Microsoft, they just said in the past weeks, they've seen signs that Fancy Bear, APT-28, another part of the GRU, is probing many political targets again, campaigns, political parties, political consultancies. There's no doubt that they are at least seeking to do a replay of 2016, where, possibly still in the last minute, an October surprise, will dump a bunch of emails, stolen data, maybe fabricated stolen data even, onto the open internet to try to sway this 2020 election. But we have to be aware that there is the potential for more. That Sandworm, this other part of the GRU, in 2016, they were the ones who hacked into the U.S. states boards of election. They had access to U.S. voter rolls, essentially. They do far more direct attacks, as I was saying. They are capable of causing blackouts, of destroying data en masse. So, if I don't want to try to predict what Russia will do in 2020, it's always losing game, kind of. They're very unpredictable. But if there is going to be a more direct attack on the 2020 election, and it will be probably from this Sandworm group, and it could include any of the things that they've shown us they're capable of in Ukraine.
You just come in with a question which you can possibly all see here. There are several questions coming in, but just this one that's up here from Roger Huang, because I think this is a good time for it. He's saying, look, it's clear states stock up zero-day exploits that they use for targets. What can individuals and organizations do to protect against this, if anything? I mean, we are talking partly on a level of principles and government and top-down action, but here as a community, we're talking as individuals and loose networks and sharing intelligence ourselves. Given the might and the discipline and the organization of groups like Sandworm, is there anything you can offer?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Sandworm has used zero-day vulnerabilities, and when they do, the zero-day vulnerability is kind of like a trump card, in this game of cybersecurity. The whole idea of it is that it's a secret vulnerability. There is not necessarily any defense against it. That's with a tool like Pegasus, as Iyad said, like to hack an iPhone. There was no defense against that, and it was, an entirely secret tool that could not be defended against. Sandworm possesses these as well, and I think that when we're talking about hacking powers at this level, if they do possess 0 days, and I don't want to say that we can't defend ourselves, and I'm happy to talk about some ways of defense. But when we're talking about these sort of undefendable attacks, the answer I've always believed is to hold these nations accountable, to inflict penalties against them. And with Russia, part of the story that I'm telling with Ukraine is that they were not held to account for what they did in Ukraine. They attacked Ukraine with impunity for years. When they caused the first ever blackouts, when they even released NotPetya, this worst cyber attack in history, they were not actually punished. It took 9 months for anyone to say that NotPetya was even a Russian attack in a Western government to impose new sanctions. There was never any consequences for their blackout attacks. So I believe that at least as a one necessary step is that we need to impose sanctions. We need to indict the hackers responsible, indict the generals who are giving their orders. We need to try to create a system of norms to deter them, to create a kind of Geneva Convention for cyber warfare. We don't necessarily have defenses against these weapons themselves, but we can defend ourselves with deterrence, with a system of rules.
And I think just as your video is going a little bit, Andy, I want to pick up on that because you're talking about both. Yeah, if you can't defend yourself directly immediately, there's a legal route. There's sanctions. There's legal pursuit, but there is also the reference to legitimacy that you've all made, which these regimes want. There's the creation of narratives and counter narratives. And Iyad, I wanted to come back to you for your thoughts on that, the nature of possible defenses, and is it mostly about getting narratives into the public sphere?
So this kind of brings me to the point about the difference between Saudi Arabia on one hand and North Korea and Russia on the other hand. And this is kind of the sad story here, because Russia and North Korea are opposed to the West, while Saudi Arabia is very much dependent upon the West. It's a very close ally of the United States and of Western countries. So if there is a regime out of the three that we're talking about that is most susceptible to pressure, that like if enough Western countries say stop what you're doing, they will have no choice but to stop, it would be the Saudis. Just like Andy said, there hasn't been enough pressure. Partly because their attacks, the Saudis are not attacking infrastructure, such as the Russians are, but they're attacking people like me, basically human rights activists, dissidents, politicians, etc. However, I would have you, there is a lot of information that is yet to come out. I mean, hopefully, if we have a peaceful transition of power in the United States, about how far the Saudis have corrupted. They have, they've had activities within the United States, and of course, Jeff Bezos was one case, and we have no reason to believe he's the only case of someone who has been hacked by the Saudis for political reasons, so as an American. So going back to how to defend yourself as an individual, like I said, I mean, given how advanced the software is, given how resourced these people are, and how determined they are to get into your phone, to be honest, frankly, if they're very determined and they keep trying, sooner or later they're going to manage to. But it's very dangerous to be cynical. I mean, simply because it's difficult to protect yourself does not mean it's useless and you shouldn't do it. Rather, I mean, we have to think of defending ourselves not as a matter of eliminating the possibility of their success, of basically being hacked. We can't really eliminate it, but we can make it so difficult that they're likely to make mistakes. And make it, I mean, if you basically design, of course, someone who's high risk, and I assume that I'm talking to an audience over here within the Oslo Freedom community, a lot of people are high risk. And there would be very good reasons for their dictators or for their governments to try to get into their phones. There are experts to seek. There are companies. If you have an organization, there are companies whose job is to defend you, digitally. But there are also things that you can do whereby you make it like, it's kind of like, instead of opening the door for the guy for someone to just walk in, I can make it such that they have to actually climb 3 stories up and then get through this door, and then get through this door in order to get into that place where I don't want them to be. And every time I force them to take an additional step is a chance for me to catch them, for them to make a mistake, or to leave a trace whereby I can actually know what happened. The most dangerous situation would be they get in and out, and you have no idea that anything happened.
Gian, I would like your take on this as well, as somebody who's high profile and presumably targeted, whether you know it or not, that sense of what you can do to defend yourself and those in your space.
I learned a lot from Oslo Freedom Forum communities over the years, actually, and the people I've met, including Iyad and Andy over the years, of just the newer tools that we can use to protect ourselves online. Also, we're individually as strong as the weakest link, and so having two-factor, I'm sure everyone knows this, having two-factor authentication on only a select number of your online accounts, isn't probably the best. Just kind of being very, very diligent about securing all online accounts and so forth. It is pretty alarming at times whenever I and a lot of my colleagues in the North Korea space and just like this general human rights space, we get alerts on Chrome or other internet browsers. It'll say like Google or whatever company has identified state-sponsored attacks trying to compromise your online accounts. It's alarming. And after a couple seconds, when that kind of fright goes away, I realized that there's so many more people who are doing a lot more dangerous work where the risks to them are so much higher. So it's kind of worth a fight here. But other things I think is just, in addition to keeping ourselves educated and protected online, is also important to keep on knowing what these governments are capable of so that we are aware of what we are dealing with as individuals and entities.
Quite a few questions coming in now, and there's just one I want to about who can or should join the defense, as it were. A question saying, what role, if any, do you see for tech and or social media companies to combat state-sponsored hacking or disinformation capabilities?
I'll take that one briefly. This is not a comprehensive response, but it comes to mind. North Korea has been engaged in PR campaigns, if you will, to try to engage the international community more recently in their controlled messages to try to promote this idea that North Korea is a normal state, that that they're just like you and me, and people there live freely, and they're just they're a normal state, and they've been experimenting with all sorts of online social media accounts on Twitter, on YouTube, on Facebook. And one of the most prominent and well-known camera presenters for people who follow this space is a young woman named Una, and she's English speaking. She's a human, of course. She's a person, but she is a mouthpiece of the North Korean regime. But unlike Lee Chun-hee, or as many of you know as like the pink lady, who's very very harsh in the way she presents her messages as a newscaster. Unlike her, Unha, she speaks in English. She seems very relatable. She cracks jokes. She'll have these on-camera impromptu interviews with North Koreans walking behind her, and asking them questions about what they like to do in their free time. Did they panic shop during COVID, even though there's 0 COVID cases in North Korea compared according to the regime, and so forth. So they're engaging in all sorts of these kind of very seductive online campaigns to co-opt the international community to believe their messages. And so going back to the question of what can tech companies do, some of her accounts and some of the other kind of related social media accounts that has been traced back to the North Korean regime, they've been temporarily blocked or shut down. Now, I don't know if that is the right answer. I mean, individually, yes, I would like the regime to not have a voice on social media. But I don't know if that's the right answer, because that's not a sustainable solution. But I think that there is a responsibility for the companies to at least flag what is a state-sponsored channel and what is a regime sponsored program online at the very least, so that the viewers can know where exactly these content and messages are coming from.
And I would like to ask Andy and Aya to come in on this idea of the responsibility of media companies, especially social media companies here. But just bringing in another question which is relevant to this, I think, an observation. Unlike in a traditional warfare attack, where it's easy to see what state power is behind the attack, as you've noted, with cyber attacks, it's often initially less clear. And so in terms of sanctions or consequences, it's difficult to undeniably prove who's responsible. So in terms of sanctions or even naming and shaming, it's kind of where you focus your efforts, isn't it?
Well, I think to address this, like, this is what I was saying is known as the attribution problem. And there's a kind of, I think it's almost become a myth in cybersecurity that the attribution problem means that you can never know for sure who is the source of an attack. And I think many countries are like Russia, and Saudi and North Korea still are kind of operating as if that holds, as if they will not be identified as the source of attack. But the truth is that we have we have a very vibrant cybersecurity private sector that does threat intelligence that I talk to all the time. They usually are able to tell me who is the source of a cyber attack based on forensic clues, based on tiny mistakes they make, code similarities, infrastructure similarities in their attacks. But that is, and they will give me the evidence, and I often publish it. It's this, we don't have to take them on faith. But the truth is that Western intelligence agencies, like the NSA, absolutely know who is the source of these attacks, because they have, forensic powers and the ability to hack the hackers. They're often sitting kind of over the shoulder of these attackers as they carry out their attacks, or just afterwards. They have amazing visibility into the perpetrators of these attacks, and they know the answers. I think we depend on them. We need them to more often publicly attribute these attacks, to not only say what the answer is, but I would like them much more often to give us the same kind of evidence private sector cybersecurity intelligence firms do, so that there is no doubt, so that in the US after 2016, for years, about half of the country refused to believe that Russia had actually hacked the Democratic National Committee. And that was in part because our intelligence community, our governments in the US failed to make that case, failed to show the public evidence, much of which, I could see myself by talking to the right cybersecurity industry sources. So that needs to change. They know the answers. I often know the answers. We need to our governments need to help us make this public case so that those perpetrators can be held accountable, and everyone agrees that we know who is responsible.
But that makes me think about Khashoggi. It makes me think about, the US knows what the Saudis are doing.
It's a very good case. As we point out, with Saudi, there is of course a political unwillingness to point fingers at Saudi. The US has this very complicated and quite nasty, partnership with the Saudi government, especially in the Trump administration. Trump has often also, of course, been unwilling to point fingers at Russia, and that in some ways is even less, understood. It's stranger, more unique to the Trump administration. But the fact is that on all of these things, on Russia, even on North Korea, the U.S. government has not properly understood its role in using its unique ability to attribute, identify, and hold accountable the perpetrators of these attacks.
Aya, can I bring up with you then? This is a point where I want to bring you back in. Also, looking at one of the questions we've got coming in, and from Natalia saying, what about other governments' demands from governments to impose stricter export controls on these technologies sold to facilitate human rights violations by repressive regimes? This is a potential field of action that is often not utilized for political, diplomatic reasons.
Yeah, so I'm going to comment on two issues. So I'm going to get to Natalia's question in a bit, but I want to comment on the platforms and what their role is. And in this case, of course, the most important platform when it comes to Saudi Arabia is Twitter. I think Saudi Arabia has one of the world's highest penetration rates for Twitter in the world. I'm not sure what the recent numbers were, but I think a few years ago it was something like 27%. 27% of all Saudi citizens have Twitter on their phone. Look, there's another key difference here between Russia and North Korea on one side and the Saudis on the other side. North Koreans do not use Twitter. It's not exactly an app which is widespread in North Korea. I'm not sure about Russia, but I'm not sure whether Twitter makes a lot of money in Russia or not. I don't think it does. On Saudi Arabia, the situation is different because Saudi Arabia has a big online population, and there's always this calculus, even on the part of the platform. If we strike too hard, we're going to lose this very big market, and this is of course this is a question that needs to go to the platform itself. I know that Jack Dorsey is going to be speaking tomorrow, but then one question I would field to Jack Dorsey if I had the chance, it would be, in December 2015, the FBI went to Twitter to tell them that Saudi Arabia had planted a spy. They had recruited an engineer who works within the company, his Saudi engineer, and he was passing information, and he hacked as many as 6,000 accounts on behalf of the Saudi government. 6 months later, in June of 2016, Jack Dorsey was sitting in a private meeting face-to-face with Mohammed bin Salman. I believe that this was in Riyadh. What did he ask him? Did he bring it up? Why did he continue to engage him? Why did Twitter continue to work in Saudi Arabia? It continues to work in Saudi Arabia until today. Why aren't they held accountable when you know what they're doing, what they're up to? So absolutely, the platforms have a very big responsibility. And frankly, even though, I'm pretty sure we work with a lot of people at Twitter who are very sincere. However, there continues to be a problem, and we really need to, they really need to engage us more actively, more seriously, and they have to take it seriously because, honestly, like Andy said with Russia, with the Russians in Ukraine, people like me, people like Jamal Khashoggi, people like Omar bin Abdulaziz, we're in a way the canary in the coal mine. If they can get so easily, that's the thing. That's the whole idea with the lesson behind the Jeff Bezos hack. If they can get into my phone, if they can get into Jeff Bezos's phone, then who's safe. But then anyway, let's get to Natalia's question about export controls, etc. with the Israelis. The fact is that NSO is positioned as a private company. But it's not really quite a private company. Keep in mind, if NSO was in it for money, and it is nothing but money, and this is just a commercial venture, having such high-profile embarrassments going over 2 years, including the killing, the murder and dismemberment of a journalist, of a U.S. resident in an embassy, I would believe if this was a company and I was running that company, I would actually say, hey, this is about time we take this seriously because it's going to hurt our bottom line. With NSO, it's very clear that this is not just a matter of profit, but it's also a matter of the will and the strategic insight or benefit of the Israeli government as well. So this is a political question. We should not simply talk about this being simply a matter of the company. It's also it's basically military software, and the Israeli Defense Ministry has allowed them to actually export this software. Now, weirdly enough, the challenge that has come to NSO has not come from governments. It has come from companies. They have, of course, there was a famous exploit that they used with WhatsApp, whereby you would get a missed call, a missed video call, and you don't even have to answer it. And it will be like an unknown number. You'll get this missed video call, and that's all. They've already gotten in. You don't have to answer it. You don't have to do anything. They're already in. And it was an exploit, and the exploit was plugged eventually. There was another exploit again on WhatsApp, because the Jeff Bezos hack, for example, it happened on WhatsApp. So it was eventually, WhatsApp is owned by Facebook, so eventually it was Facebook that brought a lawsuit against NSO, and this is actually ongoing. Omar Abdulaziz was also hacked; he brought a lawsuit. So it's basically individuals and companies bringing up these. I think even Apple, because NSO exploits a lot of iPhone's capabilities. Also, I think Apple is considering legal action, or maybe have already started it. So it should be governments that push back, but it's companies that are pushing back. And we don't really normally think of Facebook as a force for good, but this is a case in which they're pushing back because, again, this is about the safety of their users.
And I look at Chloe's question, which has just come up, Chloe Dyer on the right, about the forces that could be behind companies if they are making the right moves. She's saying, what suggestions do you have to generate more awareness of these issues among the public, encourage them to protect themselves against cyber attacks? But she's also talking about education, getting robust education in the fields of cybersecurity and technology. You guys talk and raise awareness and shine the lights on what's happening. I mean, that's what you do. But in general, I don't know, I think I might say that there's a woefully low level of awareness about what's actually going on. Yeah.
I think you make an excellent point, because I think digital defense, knowing how to secure your phone, knowing what is safe and what's not safe, knowing what is risky behavior versus less risky behavior, I think this should be a part of basic electronic literacy at this point. I think this is something we should teach in schools. I think this is something that we need to learn, everyone, not only people who are high risk. Of course, people who are high risk, such as activists, etc., they need more professional training on this, because it's part of their work, part of staying safe and keeping other people safe as well. I mean, keep in mind that I live in Norway, and yeah, I mean, there was, of course, I'm under protection. They want me dead, but at the same time, it's very unlikely for them to be able to hurt me physically.
Yeah,
very difficult for them to hurt.
Want you dead, because it's probably not the Norwegian government.
Sorry.
Just for clarification for the audience, it's not the Norwegian government.
No, it's the Norwegian. I love the Norwegian government. They're the ones who are protecting me here. But the Norwegian government has put me under protection last year because they received a tip from the CIA saying that I'm a target, that there's a plot against me by the Saudis. So the fact is that when they want to get into my phone, they want to get into my sources who might not be living in a safe country. I might have sources who speak to me, who pass me tips, whistleblowers, etc., who live in Saudi Arabia, who live in other countries. So it's far more likely that these people will be hurt than myself. Especially that I have a public persona, I'm a famous person, public person, etc. It's more the cost of targeting me is much higher than someone who's unknown. He's simply passing a tip. Maybe nobody even knows. Even his family doesn't know that he's contacting me. So it's not just about. I mean, this is why it's important for activists to really look at their security. It's not just about keeping yourself safe. It's about keeping the people you work with safe, because those people might be much more vulnerable than you are.
And Andy, on that wider narrative, and the sort of stories that you write and what you've written and published on Sandworm, for example, what's your sense of the level of engagement and kind of intelligent understanding of the threat? I mean, we're talking now, and I know those who are tuned into us are engaged and are educated about this. But what's your challenge as a journalist in this field?
I would say that just to quickly touch on what Iyad said, I don't want to. Earlier I said I don't want to that we shouldn't become cynical about the inability to defend ourselves, and I totally agree. And I think everyone watching this probably, just by nature of the fact that you're watching the Oslo Freedom Forum, should have Google Advanced Protection turned on, two-factor authentication for every account that you can. You should use Signal with disappearing messages, which I think is probably it's not only encrypted, but it makes your messages disappear so they can't be stolen and used against you by one of these information operations. You should keep your software updated. You should probably use a Google Chromebook, which is very hard to hack. We can raise the cost of these targeted attacks, as Iyad was saying. Sorry, but but when it comes to Sandworm, these are not targeted attacks on individuals that are meant to surveil them. It's not like something where you or I can prevent this attack by turning on two-factor authentication. These are mass-scale attacks against a country in many cases. The challenge that I've faced in trying to make people aware of this is that I think initially in 2015, 2016, even 2017, people thought that what Russia was doing in Ukraine was only a Ukrainian problem, that Ukraine was, it's this poor, like actually like monetarily poor country that can't afford to secure itself. That also that if you're not in Ukraine, you don't need to worry about these incredibly destructive Russian cyber attacks, because they'll just stick to their sphere of influence. And but really Ukrainians and a large community of cybersecurity researchers was trying to raise the alarm, like what's happening in Ukraine is going to happen to us sooner or later. And NotPetya, this massive worm, proved that very concretely. Like Merck, FedEx, Maersk, so many of these companies, American hospitals, became collateral damage of a Russian-Ukrainian cyber war. And none of them, in fact, even after that, wanted to talk about what had happened. They didn't want to name Russia. There was this kind of fear of victim blaming. It was very difficult to dig out the stories of what had happened to these companies. But this is what I think everyone needs to be aware of on an institutional level as well as a personal level, that we are all in the same position as Ukraine. We are at the doorstep of our adversary on the internet, and we are all subject to these same kinds of extremely dangerous and destructive attacks. And we need, it's how to defend against them is a complicated story that you probably could hire a dozen companies to and buy their products to help you. It's it's a matter of like network segmentation, patching, architecture of your network. So it's complicated, but I do think that all of these companies have the budget to do that, and they need to understand that they are just as vulnerable as Russia's neighbors.
Wake up call every time we meet, as participants in any Oslo Freedom Forum. It is, even if you study, even if you know, even if you listen to the kind of speakers that I'm with today, it is always a wake up call. We have another 15-20 minutes, and I'm just going to make sure that I'm checking in on your questions, and do keep them coming. Alvaro Piaggio asks, what role does the international community have in combating the hacking capabilities of authoritarian states? Is this something the UN or another body could address with an international legal framework? The UN is celebrating or marking its 75 years right now. Any thoughts from our panelists about whether there is actually a productive role that could be played by a body like the UN?
I'll speak very specifically to North Korea. And Alvaro, thank you for this question. I think there's something that individuals can do when it comes to trying to combat the growing capabilities of North Korea in particular. In 2019, they had their first Bitcoin and cryptocurrency conference in North Korea. It was about a week long, and I think over 100 people from all over the world went to the country. I think it was about $3,500. I think it was a couple days of conferencing, and then the rest of it was tourism. All of it, by the way, tourism into North Korea, if you go, it's very much it's a perfectly curated experience that the regime wants you to be exposed to. And so there was a lot of noise from nation states, especially the United States, the UN, for people to go to this conference, and people did go. There was going to be another one this year in 2020 at the end of February, and they had a website up. People were registering, and it didn't happen. And presumably it was because of COVID-related reasons. The state does not have, they have very, very, very poor public health infrastructure, medical infrastructure, to begin with. And so it just didn't happen. But that doesn't mean it's not going to happen moving forward. In 2019, there was an individual, Griffith Virgil, who worked for Syrian Foundation, who was arrested at the airport coming back from the conference into the United States. And the government put a case against him because he was, breaking sanctions by sharing information that could be used towards the North Korean, military capabilities. And I don't think that was a sufficient deterrent for other technologists and people to go to these conferences in the future. And so all of this is to say, in response to Alvaro's question, what can the international community do? In this particular case, when it comes to North Korea, please pressure people and individuals to not go to these conferences that are state-sponsored by the North Korean regime. They are very excellent at selling ideas. They'll co-opt the language that you and I are all very familiar with. The importance of anonymity and using technology to boost the regime, boost civilian capabilities, and so on and so forth. It's a very seductive narrative. Do not fall victim to that, and pressure people not to go. Even the UN came out very strongly earlier this year when the 2020 conference was going to take place, and discouraging people not to go as well, saying that this was breaking sanctions, both multilateral and unilateral sanctions imposed on North Korea by the US. And those weren't sufficient deterrents for the individuals to go. One last point of why these type of state-sanctioned technology conferences is dangerous is that, in addition to the mind share that foreigners will give, what the regime calls people coming in from other countries, foreigners will give to the regime. In addition to that, it lends the regime incredible legitimacy, both domestically and internationally. All of these skilled professionals from both Western and non-Western states flying into Pyongyang with their well-dressed selves, some of the top, just very, it lends incredible legitimacy that we should not, as the international community, be lending to the regime. These type of conferences have nothing to do with the welfare of the North Korean people. It has nothing to do with the welfare of the people, and it has everything to do with boosting the capabilities and the legitimacy of the regime. So pressure people not to go to these conferences moving forward.
We've spoken so many times, Ayad, about how Saudi state is different. Our examples are different. There's also, though, there's a very, very active Saudi campaign at the moment, working through influencers on social media to say, we're opening up, come and see us. It's a tourism industry thing. It's a, we are modern, we are welcoming, we are friendly. And there is a genuine debate about engage or ignore. And I just would like to hear your take on that, because it's a very determined push right now, and you see it reflected in a lot of social media posts that get a lot of attention.
Yeah, they started doing this in 2016. As I said, this is when they started the whole Vision 2030 thing. Initially, the targeted audience were mostly local, and eventually it went, global. They have been recruiting, influencers, celebrities. They even got through to some people within our community. I mean, really surprisingly. When it comes to these kind of narratives, they're actually pretty skilled. I mean, they know exactly their market. They know who their audience is, and they know how to play to their strengths and weaknesses. Of course, things were kind of going really well for them until the Jamal Khashoggi murder. I remember late 2017, early 2018, for people like me, was a very, very frustrating period of time, because we were, screaming our lungs out, saying, this is really terrible, this guy is really bad, and this is going to end badly. But, there was an overwhelming narrative. Unfortunately, it's like basically caught up in the whole certain, prejudiced opinions about what an Arab country can be, what a Middle Eastern country can show. Basically, a bigotry of low expectations, let's say, that's saying, MBS is the best you can have, don't screw this up, he's actually a good reformer, etc. March 2018, he goes to the United States, he is greeted, he is treated like a hero, he meets with Bill Gates and Oprah Winfrey and, The Rock Johnson and he's treated like a superstar, you know? The thing about dictators is that the more you give them, I mean, the more legitimacy you give them, the more empowered they feel to repress. And so he goes back, end of March, April, he's back in Riyadh, and immediately he's thinking, who do I attack next? And it is in April when he starts this conversation with Jeff Bezos. By May, he arrests the country's human rights activists. All of them, like basically the women's rights activists, end up in prison, including Lujain al-Hadloud, who's, as you know, is a very famous and brave women's rights campaigner. And it's also around the same time that they got into Jeff Bezos's phone. So it's really dangerous. I mean, the lesson here is that it's very dangerous when you give dictators legitimacy. The more legitimacy you give them, and by the way, they're starved for legitimacy. They're looking for any kind of gesture of legitimization, whether, as Jian said, about, it's a conference, whether it's a photo op, whether it's having the leader host a conference. The G20 is going to be hosted by Saudi Arabia in a few weeks, or whether it is something as like a celebrity endorsement, or a sports match, or purchasing a sports club, for example, as the Saudis try to do with Newcastle United. It's basically any gesture of legitimization, right? It's very important for us to reject this. It's very important for us to push against it, but it's also very important for us to hold these people accountable. In other words, if there's a celebrity, or if there is a sports personality, or if there's someone who is known to repeat these narratives of the Saudis, we, as human rights activists, as human rights campaigners, as even journalists who are concerned about human rights, concerned citizens all over the world, we need to actually make a stand and say, there is a cost. There is a cost to your reputation if you legitimize dictatorships. It doesn't matter who you are, how famous you are, how rich you are, how much you think that you have an audience who loves you. There needs to be a price. There needs to be a PR price. I think you're muted, Philippa.
That I was trying not to do that, Stritz. We are drawing to a close, having heard some extraordinary insights from the three of you. I just want to ask, before we give the audience a bit of time before the next session and to take more in, each of you, if those who are with us were to take one thing away, one question to self, something to reflect on, what do you want to offer to them? I'm throwing that at you, and I'm going to ask.
Right. I'll go last, so that so that Andy or Jian can have the last word. The fact that this is so tied into the concept of simple free speech, the fact that a lot of what these dictators want really is to silence us, that itself should give us some pause.
Hi, thank you. Jian, what would you like those who are with us to consider, to take?
I would say that the most powerful way as individuals to fight back against North Korea's growing cyber capabilities and just their hell-bent diet on legitimacy is for all of us to do our best to do our part in trying to provide information to North Korean people. It hits the regime where it hurts. It's the right thing to do. It's 2020, and North Korean people, as well as everybody, should have access to information if they want it.
Jian, thank you. And Andy, you're asking you to distill things to a thought, but what do you want people to take away from this most of all?
Well, I always try to leave people with the thought that, in a sense, looking at this story of Russia's cyber war in Ukraine, that we are all Ukraine, that we all are at the doorstep of our adversary. We're all vulnerable to these attacks. We can no longer treat these sorts of campaigns of sustained attacks as something that should be carried out with impunity because it's far away. But I think looking at this larger panel, in a sense, we are all, Jamal Khashoggi, we are all Ahmed Mansour, we are all the North Korean defectors that are the targets of the North Korean targeted hacking. We are all these canary lines, and we can, if we look at those cases and truly, like in an empathetic way, imagine that we could be victimized just as well, then we can learn from that. And we can also, I think it gives us the right mindset to hold the attackers accountable, which is truly the most important thing that I want to hammer on.
Thank you all, and thank you for the questions. I think we have heard a lot about legitimacy. We've heard a lot about accountability, and we've heard a lot about the power of narrative. And what I have learned again from the three of you today, and I'm really humbled to be part of this conversation with you, is that even though it is breathtaking to hear about the scope of state-sponsored hacking and its rise, its increasing power, we are not defenseless, we should not be cynical. And that is the message from the Oslo Freedom Forum and this community as a whole. Thank you all three, Ayad, Gian, Andy, for joining this discussion, and thank you those who are watching and those thanking us now for the discussion that we've had.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Philippa. Bye, Andy. Bye,
Everyone.
bye, everyone.